we're going to be talking about finishing up the imagery of clouds in the Bible, and then I'll do some wrap-up comments on Revelation 1:7, and then, as I said, we'll move into the date. So we looked at Ezekiel 30 last week, but today I want to look at Ezekiel 34, verse 12. Ezekiel 34, verse 12. Starting in verse 11, for this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. So you should recognize that from some of the other passages, the clouds and darkness image there. That's a day of the Lord, a coming of the Lord in judgment and salvation. So this passage, the larger context is that the shepherds of Israel, God's people, Israel, the leaders of God's people, the shepherds, have been abusing the flock. So they're bad, abusive shepherds. And the Lord himself says he's going to come and judge those shepherds, and the Lord himself will be their shepherd, as you read through the passage. And in John 10, when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, he's referring back to this passage here and saying, I'm the good shepherd. So what the context in Ezekiel is that because the religious leaders have so abused their privileges and their position and have misled the people and have turned the religious worship into something for their own personal gain and prestige, and the Lord has sent prophet after prophet after prophet, that finally he's now going to bring judgment on the entire religious establishment, and that he himself will lead his people. And so that's the imagery, or that's what's going on. And the imagery of the clouds and darkness is a day of the Lord coming in clouds type of image there. And so that's what I wanted to point out with Ezekiel 34. If we look at Joel 2, which is the next one, Joel 2, so you just need to turn about 1/8 of an inch to your right in the Bible. Unless your pages are really thick, and then you got to turn further. Joel is alluded to and quoted in the Revelation repeatedly. It's good. It's only a couple of chapters. I think Joel's only, what is it? It's 3 chapters. So I would encourage you that as we go through the book of Revelation, sometime you set aside time to read through Joel. And you can do it in 12 minutes probably. Just sit down and read through it. And it would be worth your while, because you'll see the images being reused in the book of Revelation. So chapter 2, verse 1, blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy hill. Let all who live in the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is close at hand. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness. Like dawn spreading across the mountains, a large and mighty army comes, such as never was of old, nor ever will be in ages to come. Before them, fire devours. Behind them, a flame blazes. Before them, the land is like the Garden of Eden. Behind them, a desert waste. Nothing escapes them. So scorched earth policy, basically. Right? They have the appearance of horses. They gallop like cavalry. With a noise like that of chariots, they leap over the mountains tops like a crackling fire, consuming stubble like a mighty army drawn up for battle. So he's going to be describing this army in various ways. He describes it in chapter 1 as a invasion of locusts, and he's going to use some of that locust imagery in this here. This is actually the Babylonian army that's coming in, that God is bringing, and it's the day of the Lord, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. And so We have the day of the Lord concept, again, being reused in a temporal judgment, and the same imagery that shows up in often in judgment passages is used here. Darkness and violence and confusion and that kind of thing. As you go through this passage, you'll see even more of that, but it's a typical way. If you looked at that chart that I sent out last week, or sent the link to, if you were able to see that, you would have seen, you know, the typical way that this type of imagery is used in the Old Testament. And so when it comes up again in the Revelation, it's not something new, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean it's talking about the end of the world. It might mean that, but in fact, almost all the time that it's used in the Bible, it doesn't mean that. So we want to, be careful how we interpret it. Let's look at Zephaniah 1:15. So Joel, go over just a couple more books, maybe another. It's like 3 books from the end of the Old Testament. So Zephaniah 1:15. Let's see. If you just glance back at verse 4 of chapter 1, you'll see that this is a judgment against Judah and against Jerusalem. And if you look at verse 7, you'll see it's called the day of the Lord. Be silent before the sovereign Lord, for the day of the Lord is near. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated those he has invited. This is an image that comes up in the Revelation too. You know, probably if you've read through the Revelation or been terrified by preaching about it, you know that there is the great feast of the birds in chapter 14, where all the armies get slaughtered, and the Lord says, come to this great feast I have prepared, and all the birds, the carrion birds, come and pick the bones. This idea of being invited to a slaughter is here in this passage, and is being repeated in the Revelation. Basically, it's that what that means is that the Lord has arranged things so that God's enemies will fall according to his plan. It's talking about his sovereignty. But to get to the verse I wanted to get to, so verse 14, chapter 1. The great day of the Lord is near and coming quickly. Listen, the cry on the day of the Lord will be bitter, the shouting of the warrior there. That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, a day of trumpet and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the corner towers. I will bring distress on the people, and they will walk like blind men because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood will be poured out like dust, and their entrails like filth. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them on the day of the Lord's wrath. In the fire of his jealousy, the whole world will be consumed, for he will make a sudden end to all who live in the earth. So here we have what looks like a complete judgment of the cosmos, of this world at least. Everybody in the world, verse 18, the whole world will be consumed. He will make a sudden end to all who live in the earth. But again, this is a local judgment that doesn't actually consume the whole world. It consumes the people in the land, which is another way that word earth can be translated and is translated in the Old Testament often. And the land is what? Well, it's the land of Israel. It's the land where the people of God are living. This is a judgment that is going to be happening against them in the Old Testament time. So even though it's using cosmic language, I see Mom has a question or comment. Even though it's using the cosmic reference, it's not actually a judgment. It's not the final judgment. Go ahead, Mom.
How many years were there between the time Zephaniah wrote this and the time that the judgment occurred?
So I'm gonna be cheating here and looking at it. It says the date is 640 to 621. Basically, is the time of his ministry. And the judgment from Babylon started in 609 with the first deportation. So if this is at the beginning of his ministry, then we're talking 31 years, 31 years, but probably closer than that, within a generation. Yeah. So, and I think that's prompted from verse 14, right? The day of the Lord, it's near, right? So the nearness here being spoken of is not thousands of years, it's in your lifetime. So just another example of the biblical usage of those words. Psalm 18, everybody can find that one, I think. Psalm 18, I mentioned that this is the same as 1 Samuel 22, David's prayer of deliverance from Saul and from all of his enemies. It's a really nice psalm. Can I get, would somebody like to read some of this? We can read maybe through 15. Would anybody like to read verses 1 through 15?
I could read it.
Okay.
So starting in verse 1 of Psalm 18.
Mm-hmm.
I will love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. The pangs of death surround me, and the floods of ungodliness made me afraid. The sorrows of Sheol surrounded me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress I called upon the Lord, and he cried out to my God. He heard my voice from his temple, and my cry came before him, even to his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations of the hills also quaked and were shaken, because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also, and came down with darkness under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub, and flew. He flew upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his secret place. His canopy around him was dark waters, and thick clouds of the skies. From the brightness before him, his thick clouds passed with hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. He sent out his arrows and scattered the foe, lightnings in abundance, and he vanquished them. Then the channels of the sea were seen. The foundations of the world were uncovered. At your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils.
Thanks. Man, what a vivid picture of the Lord's intervention on David's behalf. And David, you'll notice, is using, again, this world-encompassing cosmic language where you see in verse 15, the foundations of the earth are laid bare at your rebuke. This sounds like a, end of the world type of thing. But if you look at the superscription of the psalm, which is part of the inspired text, so the superscription is the text between verse 1 and the heading. It says, for the director of music of David, the servant of the Lord, he sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So this is David's celebration and recounting back to the Lord his great deliverance from Saul and from all of his enemies. And his speaking about his deliverance starts in verse 16, and he talks about it in the same type of language. This is, I was drowning, I was in the quicksand, I was, that kind of stuff. You sent your storm, you sent your lightning and your hail, and you saved me. But when you read the story of David, none of that happened like that. It's a poetic retelling. And so But what we do see in the passage, especially verses 9 through 11, you see the Lord and clouds, and the Lord's coming in judgment and salvation associated with clouds and thick darkness and dark clouds and rain clouds and storms and that kind of thing. And there's a rich, very rich history in the use of this image, which stems from actually God actually coming in a cloud in the Exodus. And so we have this use of this image throughout the Bible, very rich, very deep, spans the entirety of the Old Testament. And so when it comes up again in the New Testament and Jesus says, I'm coming with clouds, it means something different to a Jewish person in the first century, or to a Christian with a Jewish background, or someone with understanding of the scriptures. It will mean something different to them than what it means to us, unless we try to get into their mind and see the images that they're familiar with. So I think probably in the first century, when Jesus says, I'm coming with clouds, they would have first associated with the Daniel passage that we've looked at a couple of times, where the Son of Man comes with clouds to heaven and receives a kingdom. And then they would associate it with the Exodus passage next, the Shekinah glory of the coming of deity to judge and save. And then that would have brought in all of these. The most famous ones would have been Psalm 18 and 1 Samuel 22, because that's David, King David, and his rejoicing over the deliverance that God has given them. And they would have seen the cosmic language, and they would have seen the great images of judgment, and they wouldn't probably have thought about the end of the world. They would probably have thought about a local judgment coming, because God is going to deliver his people just like he has all these dozens of times in the past. And so their first thought would have been different from our first thought. And it's important for us to see that, so that we can understand better what the Lord Jesus is saying to those people in the first century, because he spent all this time building up the meaning of these images, and then he's reusing them for them. So that makes sense, right? I see smiles. I see some nods. Cool. Hey,
Chuck,
there's Elaine. Yes, Nathan.
I was just curious. So then, and I'm just reaching out here, and I'm just curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah.
So then, the difference between when the cloud that is essentially, embodying God or embodying his presence, goes from that Shekinah glory to kind of this deep darkness, or, is it fair to say that we see that as just being used as like a literary tool to kind of change the atmosphere of the passage?
Yes, actually, it does. It does add to the atmosphere, and that's a good observation. I do want to point out, and I wish I could remember where this passage was, but there is a passage in Exodus, and I think you'll all be familiar with it when I mention it, where it talks about how the cloud, the Israelites were, I think it's right before the crossing of the Red Sea, and all night long the cloud of fire was there, but on the Egyptian side it was dark. On the Israelite side it was light, and so the Egyptians saw great darkness. I'm pretty sure it's going to be in Exodus 14, probably, maybe 13. Let's see if we can find it real quick.
13:21. 13:21.
13:21. Let's see.
Mm-hmm.
Not
Got
exactly
the pillar
that.
of fire?
It is the pillar of fire. It's not exactly the passage, I don't think. Let's see. I'm just going to read through this kind of quick. Okay, so it's not there.
It's 1420.
1420?
Mhm.
Oh, yeah, there it is. Thanks, Gail. That's awesome. I'm going to write that down.
That was Monica.
That was Monica. Thanks, Monica. Gail, you still have to contribute something.
Best,
I'm
best
on
check.
mute. And I'm going back on mute.
What'd you say, Nathan?
Said you're busted, Chuck.
I'm busted. I'm busted. I'm looking at my Bible and not at the screen. Okay, so you see there in the passage, 14:21, thanks, Monica, that starting in 19, then the angel of God who had been traveling in front of Israel's army withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side. So neither went near the other all night long. That's an awesome passage. So I think the darkness is ultimately rooted here. And there's one other idea that we haven't started to talk about yet, but when we get to Revelation 7 and the numbering or the sealing of the 144,000, that has some association here because there's separation between God's people and they can't come near each other. And the way God treats one group of people and the other group of people is different. God is going to save his people and judge the Egyptians in this passage. And if you notice what we just read in verse 20, where'd it go? 20. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side. And then this part, so neither went near the other all night long. It's emphasizing the separation and the protection. He's isolating God is isolating his people and protecting them and keeping the enemy away. And so that the dealing of God with one group, God can judge the Egyptians and save his people at the same time. And that's one of the passages that would support the separation of God's people. You have the other picture, of course, in Goshen, right? The Israelites are not in darkness, but everybody else is during the plagues. It's that kind of a separation thing. So good question. Yeah.
I'd like to make a comment on the Psalm 18 passage we read.
Yeah.
Because when we read it, I had the same basic thought that Nathan did, I think, or part of that observation. So if you look at verse 11 and 12.
Okay.
He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, the dark rain clouds of the sky. Out of the brightness of his presence, clouds advanced. So God dwells in light, but the dark clouds are representing judgment.
Right. Very good. Yeah, I think it's good stuff. So there's one other thing that this passage reminds me of, which is kind of tangentially related to interpreting the book of Revelation, interpreting the whole Bible, but that probably becomes acute in the book of Revelation. And that is, how do we understand, since this language of clouds and hailstones and thunder and lightning, sometimes it's actually referring to clouds and hailstones and thunder and lightning, and sometimes it's not. How do we know? How do we know? So it's the old question of, is it literal or figurative? And I want to suggest some simple, really easy exercise that you can do. You see then the passage that my mom just referred to in verse 12. There's hailstones. Hailstones are being mentioned here. If you look up hailstones in the Bible and the use of hailstones in the Bible, I think there's only 6 times. And it's a really good exercise to start with the first reference and go through all the references to the end of the Bible, and to ask yourself, what type of literature is this? And is this figurative language or not? And how do I know? And that will train you or help train you to recognize when something's being used figuratively. And I'll give you the hint to the answer there, is that there's a sliding scale in the literature in the Bible that starts on one side with law and goes to, say, historical narrative, letters and stuff like that through poetry and prophecy, and then to apocalyptic, the sliding scale of literal to figurative. And what I'm talking about when I say that, I mean the frequency of literal language and the frequency of figurative language. So in law, that's always literal. Law does not appeal to your imagination. It is directed directly at your will. And when it says, you shall not go over 60 miles an hour in this zone, that's exactly what it means. It's no figurative language there. Now, when you get into the writing of history, sometimes you use some figurative language, but it's mostly going to be what we would call literal language, right? We all understand that. When you get into poetry, it's going to be mostly figurative, just slightly tipped over, maybe 65, 70%, maybe a little bit greater depending on the poem. But as you get all the way over to apocalyptic, it's pretty much the opposite of law. The apocalyptic is going to have the presumption, let me say it this way, the presumption when you read history is this is going to be literal. That's the presumption you have. And you'll come across a figurative thing in a historical account, and you'll recognize it as figurative because of some others set out as poetry or something like that. Or he's using a figure of speech that you know, the swallowed a camel to strain out a gnat. You go, okay, well, that's obviously figurative. But when you get over to poetry and anything beyond that, poetry, prophecy, apocalyptic, the presumption on that side of the ledger is going to be toward figurative language. When you pick up a book of Robert Frost's poems and you start to leaf through it, you do not expect to encounter literal descriptions. You understand it's figurative, but you don't think about it. You just pick it up and read it like a poem. And so you have a presumption of a high degree of figurativeness when you read a poem. And when we get to the Revelation, it's an apocalyptic. The visions are apocalyptic. They're part of poetry. They're actually way on the extreme of figurativeness. So if you were to go through the Bible, say, and look at hailstones, you would see that hailstones are actually referring to actual hailstones in books like Exodus and Joshua, but they're not referring to actual hailstones in books like Psalms and Ezekiel and Revelation. But what they're doing is they're referring back to the passages where actual hailstones were used by God to defeat his enemies. And they're saying, that's our God. That's our God who can use anything at his disposal to judge the enemy. And I really like that image of hailstones, so I'm going to put it here in Psalm 18. So that's how that works. So you can understand that, right? I mean, that's an easy thing to do. So extra bonus material there for how to read the whole Bible. All right, let's move on to, I have four references to coming with the clouds in the New Testament, just in the Gospels, that I want to look at real quick. I'll just make a few comments on them. So we'll start with Matthew 24:30. We've looked at this one twice before, so this one will be short. I think last week I also mentioned that there were passages where a historical thing happens, then repeated in a poetic form, like the judgment of Jael on Sisera in Judges, and like the Song of Deborah in Exodus 15 after the crossing of the Red Sea. And you can see how the figurative language doesn't describe literally what happened. And not only does it not describe literally what happened, but you can't even look at the figures being used and figure it out how it describes it. It's meant to evoke an emotion, an emotional response, an image, that kind of thing. So Matthew 24:30. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. We talked about that imagery. You can see it's inset, indented in your Bibles probably, and set out like poetry. It's quoting from the Old Testament temporal judgments. At that time, verse 30, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. So that's a direct reference to, I mean, it's in the category of coming with clouds passages, and this one's a direct reference to the Daniel passage about the ascension. The meaning here in the Matthew passage is because of the ascension of Christ, he will exercise kingly judgment on his enemies and rescues people who are being oppressed, and that they will see it, whoever Jesus is talking to. They will see it. And that would be his first century audience. They will see it. And if you look over at Matthew 26:64, you have a really interesting one. Starting in 62. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." So the question is, are you the Messiah? Now in the Old Testament, the Messiah comes with clouds and is given a kingdom. And when we read this in our Western mindset, we think, well, Jesus didn't answer his question. But listen to this answer. I mean, it says, yes, it is as you say, but I say to all of you, in the future, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. It says, you will see. Yes, I'm telling you plainly, I'm the Christ. I am the Son of Man who comes with power and glory, who gets to sit on the throne with the Father. And you will see me coming. And he's not talking about his second coming at the end of the world. He's talking about a judgment coming, which this high priest will live to see. And that's just an amazing passage. Then Mark 13:26 is a repetition of the Olivet Discourse, or another recording of it. And I'm not sure if the language is any different from Matthew, but we'll go look. 13:26. At that time, men will see, so it's right before you can see the same passage, sun will be darkened, etc. At that time, men will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels to gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. So that second passage, verse 31, is again from Deuteronomy, where it's talking about if the Israelites have been scattered because of their apostasy into all of the nations, which is referred to in the Deuteronomy passages, to every end of heaven, to all the ends of heaven, that God will gather them up when he works for their salvation. So in verse 26, it's you will see the Son of Man coming with great power and glory. This is the Daniel passage again. It's the same reference from Matthew 24. And then Mark 14:62. Same thing as the Matthew passage. Right before 62, again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Verse 63 and 64, the high priest tears his robe and says, "This is blasphemy." Blasphemy. And it's blasphemy because Jesus is claiming to be God. And he's saying, I am the divine Messiah. Yes, Mom.
I'm confused.
Uh-huh.
Because it seems to me that a while back we talked about coming on the clouds as being the ascension.
Right.
And yet at other times we say it's a judgment.
Right.
So how do you know which is which?
Well, when he's referring to the Daniel 7 passage, if that's the thing in the background, there's two things going on. I guess I see the confusion, or at least I see the point of confusion. So when he's referring to the beginning, so in the Daniel passage, this is how it goes: comes with clouds up to the Father, is given authority, power, and great glory. And then from there, we know he sits down at the right hand of the Father. In the Daniel passage, the next thing that happens is he judges his enemies. And we see that the coming with clouds is an Old Testament, in the Old Testament, often used for God coming to save his people and judge his enemies. In fact, it's used more times that way than it is for the ascension. So when the ascension passage is being referred to, then what you have is kind of a dual idea. You've got, you will see that I have been enthroned, that I have come with clouds. You will see that, and you will see, and the reason, and how will you see that? You will see me come with clouds in judgment. And so you've got kind of a dual reference there, because the evidence, or in Matthew 24, 30, it says, you will see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, which is the longer recording of Jesus' statement than the condensed ones you have that just say you'll see the Son of Man. So you will see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Well, what is the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven? Well, that he came with clouds and he's judging. That would be the, so when the Daniel passage is in view, you often have a coming with clouds. I'm deity, I am the Messiah, and you will know that because I've judged. I will judge. You'll see the outpouring of judgment. Most of the other references to clouds, are coming with clouds and things like that, are going to just be straight judgment on the authority. Judgment and salvation. Those two ideas always go together. So hopefully that was not as confusing as the initial question or the initial problem. The question was clear. Was that helpful? Somewhat. Okay, well,
I'll cogitate upon it.
that's what we have to do. Cogitate, right?
I got it.
You got it. Elaine got it.
Yes. Yeah. Look at mother, I got it.
All right.
I hear you, Elaine.
What?
I hear you.
Okay. I got it, Teach.
This is Gail. So if I'm understanding your illustrations, the last time that Christ is seen, after he goes and then comes back to be seen by the 500, isn't that the ascension in the clouds with no judgment, where he's showing that he's leaving? Is that sort of what you're saying here?
Yeah. So you're referring to Acts 1, verse. Was it 11 or something like that? Yeah. Right. So Jesus is speaking to his disciples in Acts 1 after his resurrection. Verse 9 of Acts 1. He says, after he had said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. They were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. Men of Galilee, they said, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go to heaven.
So isn't that not even related to judgment? That is literally the ascension.
That is the ascension
and the promise.
It's ascension and the promise. And I'm not sure that it's not related to judgment, but it definitely is the ascension. In fact, from the disciples' point of view, what they see is Jesus ascending in a cloud until he disappears. But from Daniel's point of view, right, he sees Jesus coming. Jesus is a small dot, and then he comes into view, coming on the cloud into the courtroom of the Ancient of Days. So this is the Daniel passage part 1, right? This is Jesus leaving earth to go, and then he's arriving in the Daniel passage. And it's not, I'm not sure, Gail, I think you're probably right that judgment is not so much in view here, although judgment is always in view when you talk about Christ as God.
Right.
Christ is having all authority.
But this is the only one I could think of where it's not spoken.
Right. It's not the primary purpose. It's not one of the primary things. The primary thing is to call their attention to, this is obviously it's an ascension. They're seeing an ascension happen before them in clouds. This would recall to them the Daniel passage. And this is part 1 of the Daniel passage. And then it's the other language about you'll see him come in the same way. Well, he's going to come with clouds, and that's where you bring in judgment. He's going to come with clouds. Yes, Connie.
Simplistic view then can be the clouds are leaving Earth, going away from us. That shows God's glory and God's deity, Jesus' deity. When the clouds are coming to us, that is the sign of judgment.
It's a sign. It's a sign of judgment. You could be one of the people being saved through the judgment, though.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not necessarily judgment on you.
Right.
So it's a sign of salvation. So when in Psalm 18, when David wrote about God coming in clouds, David is magnifying God's deliverance. As you read through that, there are talks about some judgment, but the main point is, I love you, Lord, because you saved me. He starts right out with that. So we have this, right. So there's always going to be an association of God as Savior, God as Judge, with, well, not always, but in the non-ascension, if the ascension is not the primary focus, then the focus is always going to include God as Savior, God as Judge. So. And you can do a run through the Bible and look up clouds and look at all the other verses that we haven't looked at, and it's consistent throughout the Bible, so that you have again all of the figurative language in the Bible, when we run into it later in poetic sections of the Bible, is always going to be going back and being rooted in an actual thing. God actually did show his presence with the people with an actual cloud. God actually did throw hailstones at the Egyptians. So when we see things like God did bring a flood, so when these images are reused again, it's not like they're non-historical or they don't have any kind of basis in reality. The point of the figure of speech is to say, my God is a God who delivers in history. He brought a flood. He sent hailstones. He came in a cloud. I'm in history. My God delivered me just like he did then. And so it's, and that goes to the whole controversy that some people go, well, are the miracles historical? Is it important that these things the Bible says happened? Yeah, it's important, because if God didn't actually save people, then there's no point using figures of speech saying that God's going to save you. He actually has to have had saved people for you to be able to have confidence that he will save you. So that's what's going on there.
I always feel like, just in coin with that, I always feel like the other crazy jump people take is that, they try to say that all the judgments, there was never any judgment in the Bible. This is all figurative. So there's going to be no judgment for us. It's not this, people use that to argue that, there's no hell or there's going to be no condemnation because we're all with God.
Yes, I have heard that. Thankfully, those groups are small and not very vocal. But yeah, it's a terrible way to read the Bible, to dissect it and cut out all of the historical part and make it something that's not historical. It's one of the reasons why I actually have a challenge with the amillennial method of interpreting the book of Revelation, the idealist one. So the idealist method of interpreting the Revelation is this. I think I've mentioned it before, but it bears repeating. When you look at the visions in the middle of the book of Revelation, like say the vision of the beast. So, and you ask, how is this vision related to actual events? Is the Lord actually prophesying something to John that's actually going to take place in history, and he's using figurative language to do it? Or is he just talking about principles, that there'll be really bad people and things and times that you'll have to face? So all of the schools of interpretation, except for the idealists, all of the other ones take those passages, those visions, to actually be referring to events and people that are being predicted by Jesus, actual people and actual events that are being predicted by Jesus that are actually going to happen. So they have a historical reference in the future from John's audience. But an idealist says, no, these are all about principles. Terrible things will happen to God's people, but God will be with them, and so we know that.
Right. Amen.
Yeah, that's true. But if they're only principles, then what was the thing that was going to happen soon? It's like, something was going to happen soon. What was it? A principle? So the things are being talked about. So what happens with an idealist interpreter is that the entire book, except for the second coming passages and the final judgment passages, the entire book, other than that, after the letters and before the second coming, is just about principles. And we're not going to really get to the date discussion today, but just for your consideration, I want you to think about this. If I'm trying to date the book of Revelation and I want to use something from those visions and say, oh, but this vision here of the beast fits this period of time in the first century really well. And so I think that that's when the book of Revelation was written. If someone's going to do that, then they cannot also say that vision has nothing to do with historical reality. Right? Do you see the problem? This vision refers to Domitian. This vision refers to Nero. And then later on, when I'm talking about the passage, I say this vision doesn't refer to anybody. It's about a principle. That happens a lot when you read arguments for the date. That kind of thing, where people argue one way when they talk about the date, and they argue a different way when they talk about the passage. And that's because we compartmentalize our thinking, not because we're dishonest. We also are dishonest, but we don't try to mislead people intentionally usually. So anyway, so we haven't got to the date. We won't get into it today, but this coming Thursday, 2 days from today, we will do the date presentation. I'll try to send out the stuff I sent before and see if you guys can get it. Becky, will you check your email later on, like in a couple of hours, and see if you can get it?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Chuck, I want to say I did find it. It just took me a second.
Okay. Thanks, James. All right. So it's only Becky and Connie, only Becky and Connie that nobody wants them to have the information. All right. So we're at almost 10:30. Does anybody have any questions or comments from today? We kind of went over the same material that we've done before, but I think there was a little bit more clarity and depth. So I think that was helpful.
One comment that I would have is, just in our discussion at the end there, sorry for that long rabbit trail question, but I thought it was good.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of interesting because, it just brought into my mind this other thought of, the portrayals of God is both light and dark, and it's bouncing off of the Exodus. It's light, it's life, it's salvation to those who see, hear, and receive. But it's essentially this death, darkness, judgment to those who don't. And it's kind of interesting because I originally I kind of always viewed it as atmosphere. In our culture, we kind of see dark, gloomy as always something ominous, something foreboding, some sort of bad thing about to happen. But then it's also kind of making me want to go back and examine some of my understandings of how God has presented himself throughout the Bible. Because it is this beacon of light, to the Israelites who he's protecting. But it's also darkness to those who are not and as well not under his protection. So it's kind of interesting, you know.
It is. And it's good to examine what we think about God and what we think the Bible says about God. It's always good to do that. Make sure that we're thinking the right things. So, yeah, it's the darkness and light thing. You probably all know this. The Apostle John loves the darkness and light imagery. And it is, if you just look up light and darkness in the Gospel of John, and then compare it to, say, the Gospel of Matthew, or all the other Gospels. You could add up Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All the time they say darkness and light, and you can multiply it by like 5 probably, and you wouldn't still get to what John has done. And John loves that image, and in his letters, his 3 letters, he uses that image all the time. We're in the light, we're not in the darkness, you know, that kind of thing. And that all of that image is based in the God who is light, but who comes in judgment in dark clouds against those who are in darkness themselves.